the optic nerve overload. The terrifying biological reality of seeing a completely alien color begins with the aggressive mathematical failure of the human optic nerve. The fragile pink biological camera in our skull is evolutionarily hardwired to process exactly 3 primary geometric wavelengths. Introducing a heavy, impossible 4th primary color violently forces the neurological hardware to mathematically download corrupted multiversal data. The delicate black optic cables connecting the eye to the visual cortex are aggressively overloaded by the heavy kinetic friction of rendering the incomprehensible. This is not a beautiful optical expansion, it is a violent, blinding neurological shock. Billions of delicate visual receptors mathematically misfire in terrifying synchronization, aggressively flooding the fragile human brain with absolute white-hot physiological agony. The unconditioned biological processor violently struggles to mathematically render a hue that does not exist in earthly physics, aggressively tearing the delicate geometric architecture of the human mind completely apart from the inside out just to process a single frame of the new visual reality.
The vocabulary collapse. The deep psychological terror executes the exact moment the fragile human host attempts to communicate what they are seeing. Human language is a heavy, mathematical construct built entirely on shared biological perception. We can only describe things by aggressively comparing them to known geometric concepts like fire, water, or sky. But this new, heavy multiversal color mathematically possesses zero earthly comparison. The human host is violently stripped of their ability to articulate their own stark geometric reality. When they aggressively try to explain the impossible hue, their speech violently stutters into terrifying, incomprehensible static. This absolute vocabulary collapse mathematically plunges the human species into a chilling, aggressive psychological isolation. Millions of fragile biological vessels are violently trapped inside their own minds, mathematically forced to endure a heavy, screaming, multiversal visual experience that they cannot ever share, describe, or validate with another living geometric host on the pure white canvas. The geometric saturation, expanding the human visual spectrum, violently shatters the comforting illusion of empty space. The stark, clean, geometric void around us is mathematically a lie, aggressively hiding a terrifying density of electromagnetic radiation. By violently unlocking new colors, the human eye mathematically renders previously invisible wavelengths, ultraviolet radiation, heavy thermal signatures, and aggressive magnetic fields. The fragile biological host is instantly, violently suffocated by a heavy, aggressive geometric fog of incomprehensible glowing data. The empty, pure white canvas of the air is aggressively replaced by a terrifying, chaotic, multiversal static that physically crushes the psychological perspective. The human vessel cannot mathematically look across a room without violently pushing through dense, glowing clouds of microwave energy and heavy ambient radiation. The comforting simplicity of human sight is aggressively, permanently deleted, violently replacing our stark reality with a heavy, unbreathable geometric saturation of constant, blinding mathematical noise.
The Camouflage Eradication. The evolutionary physics of the natural world are mathematically built on aggressive biological deception. Expanding the color spectrum violently executes a complete eradication of planetary camouflage. The fragile human host is aggressively forced to see the terrifying, hidden biological reality of the dark geometric ecosystem. Harmless, invisible microbes resting heavily on human skin violently ignite in aggressive, impossible multiversal hues. The dark, comforting shadows of the pure white geometric room are aggressively illuminated by the terrifying, glowing thermal footprints of hidden biological predators. The human species mathematically realizes they are constantly surrounded by an aggressive, crawling multiversal horror that was previously violently locked away by their limited optic hardware. The delicate psychological barrier of ignorance is aggressively shattered. The human host is mathematically forced to live in a state of absolute, hypervigilant physiological terror, violently unable to ever unsee the aggressive, hidden geometric monsters resting in the stark silence.
The synthetic infrastructure death. The global societal horror mathematically executes when the human species looks at their own civilization. Our entire heavy geometric infrastructure, screens, art, clothing, and digital interfaces was mathematically engineered for exactly 3 biological color receptors. When the new heavy multiversal spectrum violently unlocks, every single piece of human technology aggressively, instantly breaks. Smartphone screens violently mutate into chaotic, jagged geometric arrays of aggressive, clashing static. Beautiful, thin-line human art mathematically degrades into heavily corrupted, visually toxic garbage. The fragile human host realizes their entire civilization is mathematically painted in the wrong colors. The heavy, comforting aesthetic of the human empire is aggressively, violently eradicated in a single frame. The species is mathematically forced to abandon their entire digital and physical architecture, violently plunging the global geometric society into a terrifying, stark, aesthetic dark age where everything they ever built is mathematically unbearable to look at.
The eyelid penetration. The most terrifying physiological horror of the new color spectrum is the aggressive realization that the human body cannot mathematically shut it out. The delicate, thin-lined pink eyelids of the biological vessel were mathematically engineered to block standard visible light. They are violently, aggressively useless against the heavy, piercing multiversal wavelengths of the expanded spectrum. When the traumatized human host violently clamps their eyes shut to escape the blinding geometric chaos, the terrifying new colors aggressively bleed right through the fragile biological tissue. The heavy, glowing thermal and ultraviolet radiation mathematically pierces the closed eyelids, violently projecting a chaotic, aggressive geometric nightmare directly onto the internal visual cortex. The human mind mathematically loses the biological ability to experience visual darkness. Sleep violently becomes an absolute mathematical impossibility as the screaming, heavy, multiversal colors aggressively torture the fragile biological processor in complete, terrifying geometric silence.
The cognitive dissociation. Trapped in a heavy, inescapable, multiversal nightmare of blinding geometry, the fragile pink biological brain violently begins to break. The human processor was mathematically engineered to seek patterns, but the aggressive new colors violently flood the cortex with heavy, chaotic, unsolvable visual equations. The resulting physiological friction violently triggers absolute cognitive dissociation. The terrified human host mathematically detaches from their own geometric reality, aggressively unable to process the heavy, toxic visual data. The delicate pencil-drawn stickman violently collapses onto the stark white floor, staring blankly into the aggressive, impossible multiversal hues. The psychological timeline aggressively splinters as the heavy visual noise mathematically overwrites every single grounding human memory. The human consciousness violently shatters into jagged, dark gray geometric fragments, mathematically proving that expanding the biological hardware aggressively and permanently deletes the fragile software of the human mind from the stark void.
The visual burnout. The ultimate mathematical conclusion to the expanded spectrum is the violent, aggressive biological death of the optic system entirely. The fragile human hardware cannot mathematically sustain the heavy, infinite thermal friction of rendering multiversal geometry. After days of absolute blinding physiological torture, the human brain violently executes a terrifying emergency survival protocol. To stop the heavy, aggressive neurological bleeding, the central processor mathematically permanently severs the connection to the optic nerve. The blinding, impossible colors aggressively violently vanish, instantly replaced by absolute, heavy, pitch-black geometric static. The human host mathematically survives the visual apocalypse, but is violently plunged into permanent, inescapable multiversal blindness. The delicate biological experiment violently proves the stark mathematical truth. The evolutionary limits of human perception are not a prison. They are an aggressive, heavy, geometric shield entirely necessary to protect the fragile biological mind from the terrifying void.